Today we're going to talk about the inclusiveness of Christ. There's two passages I want you to kind of get in your mind. First is Mark 2, verse 15, and then we're going to do Luke, not John, Luke 9, verse 46. Okay, so Mark 2:15, and then Luke 9, verse 46, beginning with verse 46. Luke 2:15, just an idea of kind of what Jesus was doing in his ministry. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners, and that's in quotation marks like your grandma used to talk about, were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And then over in Luke chapter 9, beginning with verse 46, an argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child and had him stand beside him. Then he said to them, "Whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For he who is least among you all, he is the greatest." "Master," said John, "we saw a man driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he's not one of us." "Do not stop him," Jesus said, "for whoever is not against you is for you." I've been doing church life for 47 years. Some of that has been as a paid employee of church. Some of that is just as a regular old member. Here's what I found about every church. If you ask them, they will say, "We are a friendly church." Every church will tell you that. Some of them will go even further. They'll say, "We are the friendliest church in town." Right? Have you heard these kind of conversations? Because no church wants to say, "We are not a friendly church," right? We're a bunch of jerks. So every church will tell you that they are a friendly church. The challenge with that is if you go and talk to people who do not attend churches and ask them, "Tell us what you think about the church." You kind of know where I'm going, don't you? I'm not part of that. They are not like me. I don't vote for the person that they vote for. That church is only for the rich or the blue collar or the country club or whatever category they put that in. I don't believe what that church believes. So on one hand, we have churches saying, "We're the friendliest church in town." And on the other hand, the overwhelming evidence and perceptions of people who do not attend church is that we're not a really friendly people. And so we need to do some work on those two distinct positions. When I was in seminary, I had a few classes on church growth. And one of the things I learned in seminary was something they called the homogeneous growth principle. And we're not going to have a test on this, so you don't have to write that down. But basically, it's the idea that people will gather with other people just like themselves. That people will come together with people they have something in common with. And that just makes a lot of sense. And I think we've all found that to be true across cultures and ethnicities. No matter where you travel in the world, you will likely find people who have shared backgrounds, who have shared experiences, gather together. And so this church growth principle actually came out of the missionary movement. Missionaries went across the world and they said, one of the ways we know how to penetrate and get engaged in a culture is to pull people together that have a common language, common backgrounds, common histories. And so that started on the mission field and kind of came back to the church in the West. And so people that gather together in churches look pretty similar. Now, not everybody gets the perspective I get on Sunday morning, but you all look pretty similar. Now, I'm guessing you've done this, or maybe it's just me because I'm kind of a church nerd, but have you ever ridden by a church and kind of guessed the kind of people that attend the church? even though you don't know anything about the church? Have you done that? You ride by the building, you look at the sign, and you can kind of guess who goes there. Now, I was on vacation this past week and traveling a little bit in North Carolina, and if you want to really get a handle on this, travel around the South, because some churches on their church sign, right, will give you everything you need to know. Have you seen these church signs? They tell you the version of the Bible they use. They tell you their view of the end times. They tell you whether they're charismatic or not charismatic. They put it all there right on the church sign. And I guess that's helpful, and it kind of tells you who can come in, and it kind of tells you if you're not that, then don't come in. The problem is, in all of that, in all of defining church life, in all of these conversations about what are the values of our church, what's the mission of our church, and all those conversations, Jesus got wrapped up into that in the view of our culture. And so the most inclusive person who ever lived is seen as exclusive by so many in our culture because of the way church life in the West has defined what we do. And so a lot of people out there look in here and say, I'm not like them, and so I don't go. And that's a great tragedy that we've allowed the message of Jesus to get caught up into our practices. And when you look at the life of Jesus, what did Jesus do? Jesus included people. He starts off with some fishermen, Andrew, Peter, James, and John. He included them. Not a lot of people were including fishermen in that day, working class folks. Jesus said, come on, be with me. In Matthew, a tax collector, Jesus said, I want to include you. Not too many people then or now, including tax collectors. And then there was Simon the Zealot. Now we're not 100% sure on this, but we think they called him the Zealot because he couldn't stand the Roman government. And he was constantly at war with the Roman government. And Jesus included that guy. You know, think about that guy, that Simon the Zealot character in your life that's on your social media. They're the guys that blast everything, you know, horrible about the government. You know, they're always running down the government. That's Simon the Zealot. And Jesus said, come on in, you're included. And Jesus included Philip and Bartholomew and Thomas and Judas and James and Simon and the other Judas. They're probably all just tradesmen. We don't really know all of their vocations or all of their backgrounds. But Jesus included them. And the biggest kind of charge that the religious leaders of the day had against Jesus was that he was a friend of tax collectors and sinners. They said that about him a lot. Not a lot of pastors, by the way, can keep their jobs being the friend of tax collectors and sinners. Gets a little scandalous sometimes. And they said Jesus was one of those guys that was a friend of them. And that religious establishment of that day struggled greatly with inclusion. But friends, Jesus didn't. And he still doesn't. Now, if you grew up in the church like I did, there's an image we put on the listening guide today that might make sense to you. And the top one shows believe, behave, and belong. And how you got connected to the church that I grew up in was you believed what we believed, you behaved roughly like we wanted you to behave, and then you belonged, right? So they took me, little Daniel Carlton, put him in Sunday school class, put him in training union, put him in RAs and all that stuff to make sure that I believed what I was supposed to believe. But I clearly understood that belonging happened after I believed and behaved, right? I had to believe something. I had to behave like something to belong, to join the church. And that's how it worked for me, and that's how it worked for a lot of us. It's kind of how we organized the church. You believed, you behaved, and then you belonged. Now, we also thought all of that should happen in about a 3-month time period, right? So we get you in a new members class, or we get you in a revival, and we really pump you up with believing and some behaving. There's some repentance going on. And then, boy, we want you to belong. You join the church. We're going to throw you in a baptistry as fast as we can and put you on a committee the next week, right? We're going to get you all in. We're going to do it all in 3 weeks. But the question so many have in our culture is not believing and behaving questions. The question is, do I belong? Do I belong with you? And the problem we have is we answer that question with believing and behaving answers, right? You belong like us when you believe like us, when you behave kind of like us. And I want to challenge us. Again, this is 20 minutes this morning, 22, 3 minutes. This is a much bigger conversation. But I want to challenge us, is that the way Jesus did it? Did Jesus say you believe and you behave and then you belong? Or did Jesus say something else? You know, there's a lot of research out there that says, and this has been true for a number of years, we keep hitting the same thing, that says that most people decide whether they are going to come back to a church within the first 7 minutes of when they come to the church. And the clock starts ticking when they park in the parking lot. Within the first 7 minutes, they're going to decide whether they're going to come back to this church. Now, that's hard for me to believe. My pastor friends can't imagine that that's true, because in the first 7 minutes, they've had no chance to hear what great preachers we are, right? Because visitors get here before the service. So they got no chance at hearing me preach in the first 7 minutes. They haven't heard us sing a song in the first 7 minutes. All they've done is get out of their car, walk into a building, and sit down. And the research tells us that within those 7 minutes, they absolutely decide whether they're coming back. There's a little bit of other research that's really challenging that says it's the first 7 minutes and the final 2 minutes when they're leaving again. Again, it has nothing to do with my preaching. Can you imagine that? That they can make that kind of decision. And so what does that tell us? It tells us they're asking the belong question. Do I belong here? And have you noticed that some people, they'll stay in a church no matter how tough it gets, right? No matter how messed up things are, no matter all the bad stuff that might be going on, they'll stay. And they'll stay because they belong. Belonging can cover a multitude of church problems. And have you also noticed that people can stop attending church pretty quickly? And when they do, we will often try to ascribe some kind of spiritual issue to them. Oh, if they just weren't committed enough, or this, that, and the other. We'll put some spiritual words around that. But friends, could it be just as simple that they just never felt like they belonged? And the first chance they had to hit an exit door, they took it? See, the really hard thing is every church in our culture has had this conversation. Where did all of our high schoolers go when they graduated high school? And we've cried and we've had angst about that. And we've said, oh, if only we had this ministry or that ministry. And friends, I think the harder part of that is they never felt like they belonged. And when it came time for them to make their own decision about that, they said, I'm out. It's belonging, I believe. And it was true for the people around Jesus' day. They wanted to know, do we belong? And Jesus said, absolutely. You belong to me. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders of that day, they were really good at believing and behaving. They were some of the best in human history, and I'm always pro-Pharisee when we come across the New Testament. I think for the most part, these were pretty good guys who tried to serve God out of pretty good motives. And they were really good at believing and behaving. I'd have put them on every committee I'd ever been a part of. I think they were that quality of people. But the culture around them was starting to ask belonging questions. Do we belong? And the religious leaders were looking over their synagogues, and they were seeing the numbers dwindling. And they were seeing people getting further and further away from the synagogue, and they said, oh my gosh. And so they amped up believing and behaving, right? They added a bunch of rules. And they said, we got to know who you are, and we got to train you to be the kind of people we are. And they just kept amping that up while the culture was saying, man, we just want to know if we belong. And so when Jesus came around and said, hey, you belong, people flocked to him. And the religious leaders couldn't understand it because they were so ingrained with believing and behaving. If what I'm saying is anywhere close to right, what's going to have to change for us to do this well? See, we say you believe and you behave and you belong. But a lot of lost people are out there. And they're just saying, do I belong? Can I belong if I don't believe? Will you have patience with me if I don't believe? Can I belong if I don't behave like you behave? Man, I got a lot of stuff in my life. I never knew this stuff. Will you have grace with me as I grow? But can I belong is the question. And folks, if they can belong, it radically reshapes how we do the work of the church. See, I've said this for a few years, said it kind of quietly, but I think some people who just belong should probably be serving alongside us in key leadership roles. I think it'd probably be good for some lost people to serve alongside us. Some people who don't believe all the way to serve alongside us. I think it'd make our deacons meetings a little bit better. Make our leadership council a little bit better. Sunday school teachers. If we included some people who Jesus includes. You know, I've often been in this debate. Can people who don't believe play instruments or sing on the stage? If they can come lead us in worship and that doesn't lead them closer to Christ, then we're not doing something right. That's on us. It's not on them. But can they belong and really belong to us? So if it is belong and believe and behave, which is what I think it is, how does our ministry need to change? And I would challenge you to think about, when did those disciples believe and behave? Friends, it wasn't on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Come on. You know, you all probably know right now, I'm not much of a fisherman, but if I was out doing any fishing and anybody came along and said, you want to do something else, I'd say, yes, absolutely. Where are you going? Tell me when I get there. And I think we don't give credit to that. I mean, I think these guys ended up being great, but I think at the end of the day, Jesus came along and said, hey, you want to do something else? And they were like, yes, thankfully, somebody wants to include us. And so I think that's all they responded to in the beginning. And then there's that moment in the Gospels when Jesus, remember that powerful conversation he has with Peter. And Jesus asks Peter, who do you say that I am? And Peter gives him the religious answer. Well, some people say this, some people say that. And Jesus said, no. Who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ. You're the Son of the living God. That's a great believing statement. And Jesus says, you got it right, Peter. So he moved from belonging to a degree of believing, right? Not fully, not 100% in, but to a degree of believing. And yet they continue to struggle with behaving, right? I mean, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, the most important part of his whole life. He asked these disciples to behave in a way, just pray with me for a while. They can't do that. They're still not there. But they belonged all the way through the Gospels. They behaved and believed. They grew in that all the way through the Gospels. But they belonged from the beginning. And friends, my concern with how we've organized church is we've said, Daniel, we want you to believe and behave and belong. And then nobody's ever checked up on me again and said, how are you doing with that believing? Do you believe more about Christ today than you did when you were 15 and you joined Monument Heights Baptist Church in Richmond? How are you doing with behaving, Dan? Are you more Christ-like today than you were when you were 15? See, we let all of that happen in just this short period of time, and we don't have any expectation that believing and behaving continues through life. Right? And so a lot of people, again, we got around 900 folks that belong to our church. And a lot of them have checked out because I think they said, I got a check mark on believe, I got a check mark on behave, or I got a check mark on belong. I'm done. There's nothing else. And a lot of marriages have been lost. A lot of families have struggled, and our witness has been compromised because we've not carried believing and behaving throughout their lives. And Jesus said to these disciples, you belong with me. And then we're going to keep working on behaving and believing, right? And when we lead with behaving and believing, our culture, which has no reference for believing about Jesus like we do, just has no clue what we're talking about. And they turn us off. And our response to that is the response of the religious leaders of Jesus' day. We get angry about that. But Jesus said, come on, you belong with me. And friends, if we will say to people that you belong, and then we'll give them the grace and the patience to move in believing and behaving, I think we'd see a really different ministry in this church. And Jim Ayler said last week that we need to extend or expand our relationship circles if we want to change the conversation on race. Meaning that we got to stop talking about other people and just get to know other people, right? And we also need to do that if we're going to be inclusive like Jesus was. See, we gathered at this table today to remember that Jesus included a whole lot of people. Now, we gathered in Culpeper, Virginia, at Culpeper Baptist Church with people that kind of look and smell and act like us, right? But I guarantee you some people have gathered around a communion table today who didn't vote like you did at the last election, who might have a different view of what believing and behaving means in the culture that they're living in. But they gathered at this table because they belong to Jesus Christ. And that's what brings us here. We belong to him. Jesus was a very good friend of sinners and tax collectors. And we'll know we're heading in his direction when that is also said about us. That we're really good friends of people who feel like they don't belong. We have included them. They belong to us. And then we're all together working on believing and behaving. He was the most inclusive person who ever lived on this earth. He still is the most inclusive person, the most inclusive Savior anybody could ever know. Let's make sure we tell his story better to the culture around us. Will you pray with me? God, I thank you for letting us belong, for letting us belong to you with all of our failures, with all of our lack of faith and belief. Thank you for letting us belong. And Lord, we, in very well-meaning ways, have tried to include people by talking to them about believing and behaving. But Lord, I pray that you'd help us start to reshape those conversations and help us to spend a lot of time including people by talking to them about belonging and showing through our lives that they belong to us. Lord, help us to do that. And Lord, where there are people in our church family, where there are people in our community who feel like they just can't connect, they just don't belong, Lord, would you put us in contact with them over this next week? And would you help us say words, show love to them in a way that they would know they belong? Lord, thank you for the power of who you are. Thank you for including me. In your name we pray. Amen.